Welcome to the Dad Show podcast. How y'all doing? Today is part 2.
But if you're calm and you check in and it's the second one, they have no clue what they're saying. Yeah. Then at this moment, we get curious. This is my second chapter of the book. It's called Get Curious, Not Furious. You get curious. You go, what? Where'd you hear that? What do you think that means? And what's crazy is that the kids will tell you the funniest things. They'll be like, oh, that's when, this happens, or that's what Dad says when blah, blah. And they will have no real conception of what they're saying. And that's a moment when you can teach. And that's beautiful. Yeah. And all of us had those people in our lives who sat us down and they taught us without having to make us feel bad about ourselves to do so. Yeah. So that's that second one. But if it's the first one, they are triggered and they are yelling and they are just saying the meanest things that pop into their head. In that moment, we want to grab control back. Here's the truth. No child can learn anything when they're like that. In the same way that no adult can. You see those people on road raging or whatever, you're not talking them down.
Yeah.
No adult can learn anything when they're in that brain state. No child can learn anything in that brain state. So here's the real thing. When you walk into those scenarios, and I know we're like hyperfixating on the first 3 seconds here. We're not even getting into what we say yet. Yeah. But this is where most parents get stuck. What we think is, so in the whole framework, WHOLE, the first time you speak to your child is, oh, really? The first time you address the problem behavior is, oh. That's more than half the way through the framework.
Yeah.
It's actually in what we do before we parent that makes all the difference. Because if we set it up, it's like painting a room. If you go and try and paint a room and you just grab a bucket of paint and a brush and you just start slapping paint, it's going to take you forever and it's going to look terrible.
Yeah.
If you prep everything, you wash down the walls, you put the tape up if you need it, you get all your supplies, you put the drop cloth down. In the end, the product's going to look better and it's actually going to probably take about the same amount of time.
Yeah.
But you did all the work on the prep.
Exactly.
Abraham Lincoln has a quote about this. I don't remember what it is, but you can find it and put it into the episode.
I definitely will.
It's a chopping. If you tell me to chop down, this is what it is. If you tell me to chop down a tree in 3 hours, I'll spend the first 2 hours sharpening the axe.
Yeah.
Right? Because he wants to work smarter, not harder. So
exactly.
This is all parenting. You just work smarter. So you get your own brain in line. You realize my kid's not in a place where they can hear this. Then you start to unpack with them where this came from. What are you feeling right now? I don't care what they're feeling. They can't talk to their mom like that. We'll get there.
Yeah.
But let's figure out what they're feeling first. Because it's like a fire alarm. Until you figure out what's causing the fire alarm to go off, it's just going to be blaring in your ears.
Yeah, exactly.
So you figure that out. That's at that point, then you can start outlining those boundaries. We can't speak to people like that. This is how your mom's going to feel when you keep talking to her like that. This is how your wife's going to feel someday you keep talking to her like that. And that's where we're going to go down this road. Then at that point, then we can start leading and empowering. Hey, let's try that conversation again. Let's have a do-over. Or, hey, let me be you. You tell me how this sounds to you if I just storm in the room and start yelling like this.
Yeah.
Do you even know what I'm talking about? All of that empowerment, strong step, like that stuff can happen. But until we set the groundwork for good discipline, and that's what this is. This whole book is about discipline. Until we set the groundwork for good discipline, we're just going to be shooting ourselves in the foot. Because all that punishment stuff, you say that again and I'm going to... You just sent your kid even deeper into that brain state. They couldn't hear you before. They can't even hear you an hour from now.
Wow.
And that's the place where many of us grew up in supportive enough households where we could overcome those moments of disconnection. But today, with the world that we live in, you drive that wedge between you and your kid. They don't have to come to you anymore. They'll just go find that outlet somewhere else.
Yeah, exactly. Which is probably a huge issue with our world today.
Absolutely. The difference is, and I think this is a big piece too, many of us, when we were growing up, had many secure attachment relationships with other adults outside of our parents. And so if our parents were really kind of, I don't want to say acting foolish, but if they were dysregulated, they're stressed out about work, they're stressed out about money or whatever, and then they were taking it out on us, you could go to grandma, you could go to that neighbor down the street, you go to your friend's mom, you go to that religious leader, you go to that coach, you can say, yeah, my dad's just, whatever. And that person would be logical. They were an outside perspective to say, sometimes grownups are just like that. I can help you process that, whatever. Kids don't have that anymore.
Exactly.
And so I hate to put this pressure on parents who are listening, but if you want to have real impact, you got to get your stuff in, like you have to get your own self under control. Yeah. You cannot lead somebody when you can't even lead yourself.
That's so powerful of a statement right there. Wow. That's really powerful.
Yeah. I hope so. That's what I'm trying to live by, man.
Yeah.
I don't do it every day.
Man. That's really, really good. And, I noticed that whenever my daughter, she's my baby girl. So I can look at her and she knows. Mm-hmm. But my son, he wants to test me every single minute of every day.
Yep.
And I've noticed that when I lose my cool, he won't listen. It completely, just goes the opposite way, just like you stated. But whenever, I'm calm and explain to him, and, there's still consequences, but, I'm not screaming. I'm kind of talking, exactly what you said about this is how it makes your mother feel. This is how it makes your friends feel. And I do that same scenario that you noted there was, put yourself in this position. Let me act the way that you just did. And you tell me, I'm not going to say a word. You tell me what you think. Right. And like you said, just staying calm and doing that, it's received and they act so much better. But man, there's times whenever you still just lose your cool. And
absolutely. Well, and here's the thing, right? Here's the good news and the hard news. It's all wrapped up in one. It's a blessing and it's a curse. If you are the type of parent who loses your cool ever, that is a very stimulating interaction with your child. So that invokes big feelings for them. And what will happen is, and this is like where I think parents get into this really bad position. What will happen is your child will stop listening to you when you don't scream because they're just waiting for you to scream because it didn't matter until you screamed.
Yeah.
Right? If eventually the only way that they get your attention or the only way that discipline is ever handed down is when you yell, they will actually, we've brain scan studies. So people put kids in fMRIs and they talk to them. They can see this happen. They will tune out your voice, your talking voice, the same way that you or I can tune out an air conditioner that's running in the background.
Wow.
They'll tune you out because they're waiting to be yelled at.
Yeah.
And it's not because they want to be yelled at. It's because when we get into that habitual relationship with them, it just becomes something that they are conditioned to wait for.
Yeah.
And so they'll actually, this is kind of the paradox that we're kind of what you're saying, like your son doesn't like when you yell at him and it doesn't seem to work, but yet he almost goads you into it because kids are like, I will, if this bad thing is going to happen to me anyway, I want to have some say over when it happens. And here's I don't know how dark you want to go here, but what we've experienced with kids who have what's called ACE scores, which is adverse childhood experiences. These are kids like kids from the foster system, like kids who were raised with abusive parents. This goes beyond just, oh, my parent punished me, right? Like let's put these things on different landscapes. But what you see with especially girls who are abused in a way that is sexual in nature, that sometimes what psychologists and psychiatrists have noted is that these girls will start to seemingly invite this abuse because it's so disorienting to them that the only way to have control over it is to seemingly invite it. Now, of course, they don't want it. It's antithetical. It's traumatizing and horrible and awful and causes them immense emotional, physical distress. But having control over it feels like some semblance of this. And so when you have there are kids who seem like they're just asking for punishment, like they are just pushing you to punish them. these are the kids who are actually most affected negatively by punishment. They're the kids who are most hurt by it. They're the kids who are most hurt by the disconnection. And they're seeking out that punishment to have it on their terms because they so desperately hate it that they're like, if it's going to happen anyway, it's going to be on my terms. And that's when people say like, well, you have an easy kid, or gentle parenting works for gentle kids. And by the way, I don't call myself a gentle parent, but people will say things like that. Or, oh, like if you had my kid, some kids are just strong willed. And if you had my kid, you would know some kids just ask for it. You show me a kid who asked for it, I'll show you a highly sensitive kid who desperately needs to be the one that's never, ever punished because they are the ones who are most deeply affected.
And like you said, it's going back to an underlying condition. It's not them acting out at that. You need to go and give it a name. You're the reason and for it, and identify it, and then come back and build your new foundation from it. Because, like you said, it's always something that's causing that.
And what's the need that's being expressed? I mean, you have experienced this more than probably most parents, of understanding that, hey, if certain things are not met with my kids, they feel a lot more discomfort. They struggle with this or that. They have, physical pain in their body if we're, not careful about whatever.
Yeah.
When they're experiencing that, you don't place the same accountability burden if they're lashing out while they're in pain, if they're lashing out while they are having these emotional, they're having a bad day, or they had a bad meeting or whatever. Like, you don't when they got some bad news, you don't place the same burden in the same way that when you have a coworker who just got divorced and they are a little snippy with you, you probably give them a little bit more grace.
Yeah.
What we fail to realize as parents is that most behaviors, problematic behaviors that we don't like, are just expressing unmet needs. They're really just saying, I'm hungry, I'm tired, I'm hurt, I feel lonely right now, I had a bad day at school, whatever. That's what they're really trying to communicate. And they're just doing a really poor job of communicating that. Teaching them how to communicate that is so much better than just trying to punish them out of communicating in that way.
Yeah. I had a guest on here a couple of weeks ago. His name was Nathan Ray, and he talked about that same exact thing. Like, when your kids come home from school, don't just say, how was your day? Open-ended questions to them, to where they have to speak out and tell you their feelings and let you know, and open those lines of communication so that if they're a little bit aggravated, they're a little bit out of control, it's because of this, this, and this. It's not just because, it's Tuesday at 3:30 and I'm going to give my dad, living crap time all day. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. What I say in the book is, if you want a quote to pull out, what I say is, we have to realize that when our kid is giving us a hard time, they're not trying to give us a hard time. They're showing us that they're having a hard time.
Wow. Yeah.
Like that's your kid they're not giving you a hard time. They're having one.
That's a bold statement, man. That's pretty good. That's really good.
Because think of it from this perspective. You are your child's source of security. This is, by the way, why most parents will get upset when their kids are disrespectful. Look, I put a roof over your head. I put food in your belly. I make sure that you get to school on time. I keep warm clothes on your back. Your child knows all of those things.
Yeah.
If you had a person in your life, you kind of do, right? Some of us have bosses, right? But if you had a person in your life who is dependent on keeping you housed and fed and warm, there is no world where you are intentionally making that person upset.
Yeah.
Now, maybe you're so safe with that person that you're willing to be your honest self around them. And sometimes that makes them upset. But your child has a vested interest in trying to make you like them. It's why babies smile at us when they're first born, so that we'll like them and not leave them by the river. We know this. The same thing is true for your kid. If they are giving you a hard time, it is not because they're trying to manipulate you. It's not because they're trying to get away with something. It's not because they think that you're a sucker. That's what we were told when we were kids. We now know this is not the truth. We know that this is not the case. You put those kids again in an fMRI machine, they're not giving you a hard time. They're experiencing distress when they do those things. And it's very different They are not, no kid that actually, we'll say it this way, they lack the developmental mental capacity to be able to manipulate. Being able to manipulate someone, you have to understand social cues. You have to understand how your now actions will predict future actions. Kids do not have the developmental capacity to do those things. Somebody tells me their toddler is manipulating them so that they will do X, Y, and Z. I tell you, you're giving them too much credit. They literally don't have the brain development to do what you think they're doing.
So do you think that people kind of go whenever they make those statements, like they've been manipulated in their past and that's exactly what they're just reliving through that moment?
What's interesting to me is that oftentimes, here's another quote you can pull out.
Let's not tell them too much about the book now. I want them to go buy it.
No, no, this isn't in the book. This isn't in the book. I'm just saying it, most of the time what I've experienced is that adults will hold kids to adult expectations while they will hold themselves to kids' expectations.
Yeah.
So you get into a spat with your partner and you say something you didn't mean. You're looking for that person to say, I know you didn't mean it. You were just upset. You lashed out. You don't really, whatever.
Yeah.
Exact same thing happens with your kids. They were trying to get one over on me. We will look at kids and we will hold them to expectations that we don't even hold ourselves or adults to, which is an ability to control their emotional landscape. So when somebody says like, my kid is doing this, it's not even that that they've experienced that. It's that they have so bought into this idea that kids are in control. Kids have very little control over their emotions. Because this is a lot of this is neuroscience. I'm sorry if I'm boring your
No, you're good.
But there's a part of their brain. It's called the OMPFC, the ocular medial prefrontal cortex. It's a little tiny spot. Think of it like the very center of your forehead. That's like where it is. It's just an inch back. That part of their brain is one of the least developed parts. It's one of the latest developing parts. It develops in the 20 age range, 18, 19, 20. That OMPFC is that's the part of your brain that says to the feelings part of your brain, this is not that big of a deal. Kids literally don't have it. Wow. So for them, something that feels like a big deal is a big deal.
Yeah.
It just is a big deal.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like one. It is as big of a deal as anything else is. And where your brain can say, I'm real mad that my team didn't win in the playoffs. I got real upset about that, but come on, there's always next year. I'm a Chicago sports fan. I'm very used to saying there's always next year. Doesn't matter the sport. It's always true.
Always
the
next year.
Bulls or the Bears or the Blackhawks. There's been some moments when we've had some success. The 90s were a great time with the Bulls. Other than that, basically we're terrible at sports. Yeah. I can get frustrated at my teams and then I can move on and say, this is not that big of a deal. Exactly. Your child does not have the part of their brain that allows them to do that.
Wow.
And so that's where I would say, like, people have been sold this lie, kids manipulate, or adults, even adults that are dysregulated or trying to be manipulative.
Yeah.
There's a reason why when you look at like a sociopath, why they're able to convince people and be so harmful to others. It's because they're not being driven by their emotions. The rest of us are being driven by our emotions. It's pretty hard out there to do life.
Well, that's, and I see exactly what you're talking about in my daughter. So huge because of all the surgeries and medical trauma that she's been through, like, days whenever she stays strong up until about 2 or 3 days up until she's got a surgery coming. And 2 to 3 days before she stops eating, she stops sleeping. She's like, the PTSD, yeah, exactly, is real in that scenario. And, my wife and I don't try to play it off, but we try to, pull her away from thinking about the surgery. Tell me where you see 3 colors of blue in this room, like, try to direct her brain in different directions. And, maybe we need to pay more attention to that just because of what you just, you talked about was, it is it's a big deal, but to her, it's a really, really big deal,
Well, and what you're doing is actually one of the evidence-based tips that I talk about in the book. It's called grounding, right? So this is a part of I call it color detective in the book, but basically what you're doing is when she has to identify colors, she has to use a part of her brain that in those moments when she's being driven by her emotions, like literally if you put her under a brain scan, you would see that the part of her brain that thinks is very dark, not a lot of electrical activity. The part of her brain that feels lit up like a Christmas tree. In those moments when you're saying find 3 colors of blue, what you're actually doing is you're kind of forcing the part that's dark to power back up in order to do some work. And so what you're acting as in those moments is you're essentially allowing your OMPFC to act as hers. Yeah. She can't do that. But this is the beautiful thing about parenting. Just because our kid lacks the developmental capacity to do it themselves doesn't mean that they can't do it. It means that we have to walk them up to it. And so what you're doing in those moments is you're actually walking her up to it. Now, we can have a much longer conversation on a follow-up podcast about how we process traumatic things with kids in a way that makes it so that they're not as deeply affected by those things. But in the short term, in those moments, you're doing exactly what you should be doing. Now, just imagine that we can very, very clearly understand if an adult had that experience related to PTSD, like we would give them allowances to not eat, to not sleep. Like we would understand that. Yeah. What's even trickier with kids is when they do that over seemingly foolish things, like what color pants they have on, or the fact that we ran out of time and we didn't get to go to the donut shop. Yeah. And they feel like the world is ending over those things. And we go, that's a silly thing to be upset about. But to them, it's their whole world. Yeah. And so those are the moments where you have this choice and you pick the better choice, which is in the whole parent method. This is L, lead them out. But you're picking the better choice of how am I going to work with your brain to get that part of your brain, even if just instinctually you're doing this, I'm going to get that part of your brain that can think back online where it can get back in the driver's seat and we can move through this so that we can get you to eat some food so that we can prepare for the surgery. The trickier thing for a lot of parents who are not faced with the same level of just problems that you guys have to cope with is, do parents have the emotional intelligence to do that when their kid is melting down over the color of a cup? Yeah. And if the answer is yes, you will never have to punish your kids again. Because you do that, you come back to it later, you go, so it turned out that cup thing probably wasn't as big of a deal as we thought, huh? Yeah. What should I say to you next time that you get really upset about a cup? I don't know. Okay. Well, how about I just do what I did last time? We do the color game again? Okay. And then the next time, you got to do it again. Third time, they do it themselves. Yeah. And that's the thing. You keep punishing kids. You're just redoing and redoing. You go the way that you're doing with your daughter. If we have the emotional maturity to realize that beyond the really big things, even the small things feel big to them. Every disappointment feels like they got divorced. That's what I try and tell parents. Wow. You go, this isn't that big of a deal. You don't get that toy in the store with them and they're screaming and shouting. Yeah, we could talk about entitlement. Let's have that conversation later. But to them in that moment, feels like they just lost their job. Yeah. Feels like they just got divorced. Feels like, because that part of their brain, the part of your brain that feels fully developed in your toddler, they have the same capacity to feel as sad as you have ever felt in your life. They can feel that sad. Wow. But they have no capacity to control it. And that's the real trick.
Now, thank you for watching part 2 and come back tomorrow to watch part 3. Thank you for listening to the Dad Show podcast.
Thank you for listening to the Dad Show podcast. Please like, review, and subscribe.